we're gonna. Anne will give us more of a report. Anne will give us more of a report later. We're gonna start with Havdalah now. We begin Havdalah by saying goodbye to the angels who watched over us these past 25 hours. And if you have questions on the angels who were greeting with the words of Shalom Aleichem, we'll learn about that in about 10 minutes. And I think that at that point, if it's not already, YouTube will be on, so we can stream that as well, or at least record it for later use. We're going to lower the lights, maybe. All right. Just, Ricardo, can you hit the first couple switches in there? We'll see how dark it gets in here. Seitchem l'shalom, malachei hashalom, malachei elyon. Mi melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hinei el Yeshuati, evtach velo evchad. Ki ozi vezimrat ya, Adonai vayehi li lishua. Ushavte mayim besason, mimaynei ha-Yeshua. L'Adonai ha-Yeshua, alamcha virchatecha selah. Adonai tzvaot imanu, miskav lanu Elohei Yaakov selah. Adonai tzvaot, ashrei adam boteach bach. Adonai Hoshia, HaMelech Yanenu ve'yom korenu. LaYehudim hayta ora, ve'simcha ve'sason ve'ikar, kein tihye lanu, kos Yeshuot esa. Uveshem Adonai ekra. Another part you all know. Kodesh, Beis Kodesh L'chol, Chachotenu Imo, Zareinu V'Kaspenu, Yarbei Kacho V'Kacho Chavim B'Layla. Shavua Tov, 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 Shavua Tov. A good week, a week of peace. May happiness and joy increase. A good week, a week of peace. May happiness and joy increase. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimhera B'Yameinu, Yavo Eleinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David. Good week.
All right, Shabbat Tov.
A peaceful, happy week. Those who are here, come sit in the first couple of rows. We can be in
Amen, amen,
conversation.
amen. Yes. Yes. Yes, we are. Easy does it.
Okie dokie.
Hey everybody, as we're testing out the microphone to see if it works for me. Okay, great. So hi everybody, I'm Mark Goldstein. Welcome to Scholar and Buzz. You started that, it's your fault. Welcome to Scholar in Residence Weekend event number 3. I want to thank you all for being here, and more as importantly, thank all the sponsors for contributing and making this possible. I want to thank the Men's Club and the Scholar in Residence team, in particular Mark Zuckerman and his entire family for helping out, and Erwin Barney for his leadership, and everybody else who helped out tonight, Ken Leon and others. I didn't catch everybody, so thank you all for contributing your time and making this event possible. So tonight, we are here to partake of a nice conversation about some interesting things led by Shira Tolushkin. So I'm going to do a quick intro. Many of you have already heard the intro today, but so Shira, as you've heard, is a skilled writer and storyteller. She's the child of a renowned scholar and author, and her mom was also an author and translator as well. Her roots are in New York in Jewish day school and Jewish summer camps, and then after that, she went over to Yale and then to Harvard. So don't hold any of that against her. She's still all right and still kind of fun. And right now, she is, in addition to other things that she is doing, she is a professor at the City University of New York, also known as CUNY. So what she does by day is she writes for a diverse group of publications. Examples of the breadth and depth of her stories and diversity include, in the pop culture reign, The Mustache Returns at the New York Times, Gender-Neutral Emojis Get a Complicated Update at Wired. In the fashion area, she has a story called How Catholic Fashion Took Over the Met, the Washington Post. And on the more serious side, she has a story about how Pittsburgh Jews buried their dead as martyrs as martyrs, and that was in Tablet Magazine. So quite a diverse portfolio of work, and she really does a great job of melding traditional Jewish stories and learning and making them relevant in pop culture settings and to popular topics. So as you've heard this morning, and you're about to hear in a second, she really engages us in the way she ties these two things together, the historical stories, Jewish stories, and things that matter to us today. So last night we heard about maintaining relationships with friends who have different opinions or approaches to life than we do, and how to still be friends with people who we don't always agree with all the time. And today we learned about getting a better understanding of why many, or some Jews anyway, in the world think it's better to learn Torah than maybe to do good deeds and to do good things. And we heard about how learning Torah may be more important than caring for a family member or even tending to an injured animal, which is kind of striking, but with the stories that Shira told, we were able to appreciate and understand that context. So that sets us up for tonight. So tonight we have Rabbi Ari Averbach, and as you know, Shira is here as well. So we're going to have a discussion exploring angels and demons in Jewish history, as well as the belief of Jews in supernatural beings. So enjoy. Shira, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark, for that introduction. And it's been so wonderful to spend Shabbos with this community. So thank you all for coming back. Now it's always fun. I have a sense of some of the faces in the room and some people. And if anybody's not hearing me, just kind of give a wave and I'll talk a little bit louder. So as Mark mentioned, we're going to talk tonight all in the Jewish tradition and what those stories and how at different moments at time those stories have reflected different concerns and hopes and dreams of the Jewish people. So if you haven't already realized, right, kind of my focus this week is on how do we engage with parts of the Jewish tradition that don't make intuitive sense to us. And so I think this will be just a little bit of another example. Wait, sorry, I thought give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. And my hope is also, I'll say, so I think the way we'll do this is I'll kind of just talk for maybe 7-ish minutes and kind of give a little bit of an overview of how beliefs in angels and demons and other supernatural beings evolve at different points in Jewish history. Then Rabbi Ari and I will talk and have a conversation about how we engage with those ideas, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And I'll say that I'm also really interested in hearing tonight about people's own experiences or times that you've maybe encountered or had a story or something happened that made you wonder if maybe there's like more out there than we fully realize. I think sometimes we don't know what to do with those experiences, but we sometimes have had those moments. And so this is a safe space for all of us to discuss that. Okay, so there's an idea sometimes that you'll hear where people will say that like, oh, Jews don't believe in hell, and we don't really believe in angels. Like angels is a Christian thing, right? And anybody who's read the Bible kind of immediately will realize that that can't be true, right? Angels show up throughout the Bible. Like, just to throw it out to the audience, what are some examples people can think of in the Bible, in Genesis or elsewhere, where we get angels? The Akedah, right? So binding of Isaac, an angel comes down and tells Abraham, stop your hand. What's another story? Oh, right. So in the Bible, it just says, and there was like an Ish, a person there, and the tradition understands it that was an angel. I think the angel Michael. But in the text, I guess you could maybe say it was just a man. But yeah. Yes. That's right. So Abraham and Sarah in their tent, and there's 3 men, and then it turns out there's 3 angels, and they come with a message, and they're messengers of God. So we have angels. Demons also don't show up until the kind of post-biblical period, and we'll talk in a moment about why. But when we look at the first introduction of angels in the Jewish tradition, it's very clear that in the Bible, in Genesis, we're trying to negotiate the difference between humans and God, right? So the beginning of the book of Genesis is very concerned with how do we draw this line. So, in the very first story, Adam and Eve, they eat from the tree of fruit of, they eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And their eyes are opened, and now they're like the gods because they can know the difference between what's good and what's bad, right? So that makes them different than animals. So suddenly we have this new category of being in the world that's not quite an animal, but they're not God. So what do we do? And interestingly, people often assume that God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden as a punishment, right? He's angry, they transgressed his rule, they can't stay. But if you actually read Genesis, what God says is, oh no, now they'll eat from the tree of life, and then they'll become divine beings. And so you see this idea that the main difference between humans and the divine world is immortality. And actually in Psalms, we have a few instances where God is angry at angels who've misbehaved, and he threatens them with mortality, that they'll die, and then they'll die like men. So it's, or B'nai Adam, like people. So it's very clear that there's something about mortality. That's the difference, right? And then we get all these series of stories. We have the Tower of Babel, where humans are trying to storm heaven and take their place up there. We have this very enigmatic passage of renown. And that's when God says, okay, not only now are you mortal, but you'll only be able to live for 120 years. So he puts like a further limit. And it's unclear who these B'nai Elohim are, these sons of God. They show up one other time in the book of Job. But so in the beginning of the Bible, we have this, angels show up as this sort of quasi-intermediary category where we're trying to distinguish between what makes us human and what makes God God. And then throughout the Bible, we see this continued, the concern in that differentiation with the divine world is to sort of assert God's total power. So there's a concern that there's kind of a cosmopolity of power. And one thing that I find totally fascinating is as you look at how our conception of heaven looks, it very often mirrors the reality of what political power looks like on the ground. So in ancient Mesopotamia, and sometimes when I give a longer talk of this, I'll have like a PowerPoint and I'll show kind of the political maps at the time because it's so interesting how it maps out. So I'm just gonna point for reference because it'll help me kind of remember all of it, but okay. So, so if you look at like a map of ancient Mesopotamia, kind of the world where the Psalms and a lot of biblical theology is being written, the way it worked politically is you had all of these kind of neighboring kingdoms. So obviously we have Judea, and then in the north, yeah. Yeah, can you be the different nations? Yeah. Okay, so we have Judea. And then in the north we have Edom, right? And then in the south we have the Plishtim, the Philistines. And you have all these different kings. Thank you. And you have all these different kings of their own categories, and they're all vying for power. And what we want, and the kind of constant struggle is who's going to be the more powerful. And there aren't these complex courts, they all just have messengers. And at that time, what is the image we have of divine power in the Psalms? It's God as the head of a council of other gods, basically. And we can talk about the theology of that later, if that upsets people, because I know it's not always what you learn in Hebrew school, but basically, when we have like all these verses, so in the book of Amos, right, he talks about how surely the Lord of God does nothing without revealing it to his council of other gods and servants. In the book of Job, which we just talked about, it opens up with God convening a council of the other divine beings. This concept elsewhere in the Psalms that the divine leaders will all come together to worship in joy. And so there's really, and so that's why we get this strong assertion that God is the most powerful among all these beings, and angels don't have their own identity. Sometimes it gets read back into the tradition, but they're just messengers. And we know the word melachim means messengers. And so we get this kind of sort of, they kind of are just like an extension of God's will. So God can't always show up in incarnate form in the world, and so we have angels who sort of do his work like a messenger. And then it's only later, kind of in the post-exilic period and in the Talmud, and kind of Ezekiel, depending on when it's written, this is more academic, so if someone wants to talk about that in the Q&A, I'm happy to, where we start to get these very complex divine courts, right? So suddenly there isn't really a concern about asserting, like monotheism has been won. Polytheism and God being like the best among other gods is no longer the theological fight. Instead, we have a God, and we start to get these really complex divine courts, right? So we start to get like we have these images of God seated on a throne, and he's being ministered to by the seraphim, and then there's the ophanim, and then we have, the angels of like made of fire every morning and out of the lakes of fire, and we start to get this image of a God on a throne and this really complicated court. And what does power look like in the world during this period? So this is during the Seleucid Empire, the Persian Empire, where suddenly, when people think about the most powerful being they know, they're not thinking about one king among a sort of kingdom of many kings. They're thinking about the Persian emperor, who's sitting in his throne, ruling a vast, vast empire, and being attended to by legions and legions of servants and dignitaries, and there's complicated court rituals and rules. So in that world, how could you imagine your own God be the messengers of God? Because suddenly the problem is not anxiety over whether God is the most important being, but suddenly it's about access and accessibility to God. Because you're just a lowly Jew living somewhere in a corner of the Persian Empire. You can't even imagine having like an interview with the emperor, right? So the angels start to become not just God's messengers, but symbols of his presence in our lives. And so they're both a sign of his presence, but also a sign of his distance. And so that's when they start to become much more important. So they start to take on these personalities, and the traditions about the four angels, so Michael and Gabriel and Uriel and Raphael, really develop and take on personalities. And we see this in the Talmud because there suddenly starts to be all these halachot about how you're not supposed to pray to angels. You're supposed to pray to God. Like, what's going on? And we see suddenly that people have kind of lost an ability to imagine that God is really interceding in their lives. And instead they start to kind of only be able to really relate to the angels. Okay, I realize I always think that's cool, so I probably went into a little more detail about that than was totally necessary. But I'll just say that in general, I think stories about angels and demons have always reflected our concerns and our hopes for God's ability to intercede in our own lives, and for there be a kind of a world of people where maybe there's like more meaning than we imagine. Okay, so I'll speed up now very quickly through the rest of Jewish history, and then we'll have a chance to talk. So now we sort of have this world where people are angels proliferate, and this is when also demons enter, right? Because when angels start to become so prominent, we have a sense of like a whole series of cosmic forces, and we have kind of corollary like demonic figures, and we see throughout the Talmud that demons really get integrated into everyday life. So I have, lists of some of my favorite stories here of demons, but demons pop up in very everyday circumstances. So we have a Talmud story where a demon is summoned to court because he has to pay damages for somebody's house that he broke into. Rav Papa, one of the big rabbis in the Gemara, who comes up anytime someone gives a siyum, so that ritual when you finish a passage of Torah learning, we mention Rav Papa, and he had one of his servants was a demon who knew lots of halacha and always and it was very convenient because demons, as it turns out, are allowed to work on Shabbat. In fact, this comes up elsewhere in Eruvin, in another part of the Talmud, because Elijah, the prophet, isn't allowed to travel on Shabbat. And so there are some things that he doesn't know. So there's Yosef the demon, who can go as his emissary because he can travel on Shabbos. So demons really kind of become part of the everyday. And then we sort of move from there to suddenly, so I'll jump from the Talmud. If we want to talk about the Middle Ages, like a lot of things happen in the Middle Ages, and that I think has to do a lot with persecution that picks up, and people are trying to now understand in different ways how much control God has over the evil that's happening to them. But we can talk about that in the Q&A. So we'll skip so we have suddenly this complex, very versatile, personal, like literary, rich tradition of angels and demons. And then we get to the rationalists. And so Maimonides shows up, and Maimonides was a big rationalist, and he writes in his Moreh Nevuchim that angels and demons never existed. He's like, anyone who believes in them, it's shtuyot, it's idiocy. Which is like, Maimonides read the Bible, right? So it's very hard to understand what he's coming from and where he's talking about this. And then, so Maimonides' son sort of comes in and he says, no. What my father meant was that any story we have of angels or the rabbis believing in demons was dream literature. It all happened in the context of dreams, which is a pretty like diplomatic, neat solution that we have there. And then it's sort of in the post-Enlightenment age. I know we talked a little bit this morning. We talked about the Vilna Gaon, our intense Torah scholar. And he's the one who says, like, it's impossible that Maimonides believed this because the belief in angels and demons is central. And it's interesting to understand how in this post-Enlightenment universe, there's this desire suddenly. It's not like the age of the Talmud, where for people, the belief in demons was similar to how we think about science, right? It was like, why do you get sick? It was the way of making sense of the world. Suddenly, after kind of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, a belief in demons becomes not so dissimilar from the need to assert a belief in God, right? It's, sociologists call this the second naivete, the idea that everybody in the modern world has to proactively read themselves back into faith in a way that we didn't have to do kind of in the Middle Ages when there was no other way to think about reality. Like none of us, well, talk to me after, but none of us like choose to believe in gravity, right? It's not something that we have to like assert. But I hope you're laughing because you don't believe in gravity and this is like a
I don't believe in gravity. I can talk about that. I hope that everybody here believes
the night takes a strange turn. But, right, so there's the second naivete that you suddenly, in the face of a world where it's not quite obvious that the supernatural has to exist, people have to claim it for themselves. And there's a great, I'll end on two stories and then we'll chat for a minute, or longer. And so we have this great story, I think, about of how we navigate this time period, where one of the students, so Rabbi Mendel of Kotsk was one of these Hasidic rabbis, and he's great. He's the one, if you ever read books of the Hasidic stories, he's famous for many ones. He's the one, if you've ever heard the story that he said people should have two sayings, one in either side of their pocket, right? So one should say, Ani kfar ve'efer, quoting Abraham to God, I am but dust and ashes. And you should have a piece of paper in one pocket, and then in the other pocket, you should have a piece of paper that says, Bishveli bara ha'olam, for my sake was the world created. And then, because at different moments in our lives, sometimes we need to remember we are dust and ashes. And then, and we need to humble ourselves. And then sometimes we need to remember, for your sake alone, just for you to exist, was the entire world created, and give ourselves that sense of confidence. So he's great. And then at the end of his life, he thought his life was worthless, and he burned all of his letters. So we only have reported stories of him, and we have none of his writings, which is tragic. But one of his students asked him, okay, Maimonides denies the existence of demons and magic in this whole world, but in the Torah, it's written that they all exist. What do we do? And so what does he say? How does he resolve it? He's like, listen, they're both true. In the days of old, demons and angels and magic existed. And then Rambam came, Rambam's Maimonides in Hebrew, Rambam came and said they did not exist. So out of respect for his great learning, the demons vanished. And then, in the 1800s, the Vilna Gaon came, and he said, what? Of course they exist. So they returned to the world. And so I think what happens now in this kind of, to use another term that gets brought up, is this disenchanted universe, this universe where people feel like meaning is something that we sort of have to read into it. Angels and demons have moved in their significance from the realm of theology, of how we sort of really shape our belief, to the realm of literature and poetry and art. And they become something that's sort of it's not like a faith assertion in the same way, but it's one of the tools we use as humans to fashion meaning. I was just in the rabbi's office and I was noticing that he had all these books of Isaac Bashevis Singer, one of the great Yiddish writers whose stories were full of demons. And when people used to ask Isaac, so do you really believe in demons? He would just say, well, if demons aren't real, then who's stealing all my manuscripts? So I think for many of us, we are in the reality of the modern world we live in, trying to navigate between a God who we want to believe is perfect and just and maybe beyond all knowing, and a universe that's still kind of impish and lovely and personal and accessible to us. And so in many ways, supernatural beings, angels and demons come help us bridge that human-divine gap. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk more about what that looks like.
All right, so thank you, because some of you have been asking me questions in the last number of years about demons and angels, and I'm so happy to have now an expert here, or at least somebody who can explain some of it. And I guess all I need to do is write a book saying demons never existed, and then they'll disappear from the world until somebody else writes a book and says, actually, demons have always been here.
They'll give them whiplash.
Right. And so what makes Jewish demons different than Christian demons or other religions' demons?
Oh yeah, that's a great question.
I don't know.
No, that's fair. We shouldn't assume. Sorry, you just made me remember. I had a very Orthodox cousin growing up, and when I was in her house, her mom used to feed the cat scraps that the neighbor would give her, and she was very upset that the cat was being fed non-kosher food. And the mom said, "Well, how do you know the cat's Jewish? So how do we know demons are Jewish?" So demonology, and these concepts obviously exist across many traditions. In Christianity in particular, is actually distinct from most other traditions because they're demons and angels are sort of absolutely good or absolutely evil. So if somebody is possessed, like demonic possession, you're either possessed by a demon, which means you're being possessed by Satan himself, or you're possessed by the divine spirit, right? And this was a big thing in the Middle Ages. So you'd have young women rolling around in the snow outside saying they were suffering on behalf of people in purgatory. And the councils would come together to be like, do we think it's legit? And she's, a saint? Or is she possessed by a demon? And we should kill her. And in Judaism, our demons are not wholly evil in that way. So first off, I'll say demonic possession is a little bit different. This is a slight detour because in Judaism, you're not really possessed by the spirit of a demon. You're often possessed by the spirit of a person who died. Do people know what a dibbuk is? Is that a term? Okay, right? So a dibbuk's not a demon who's coming from hellfire, right? A dibbuk is a spirit of somebody who died who maybe has unfinished business on earth. And so they're good and bad in the way that all of us as human beings are good and bad. And then also, we actually have a tradition where you can also be possessed by an ibor, which is a soul of a scholar. And this comes up more in the late Renaissance period, where, so the Shulchan Aruch, the main halachic code, was written by Rav Yosef Cairo. And he believed that a lot of his writings were written when he was possessed by the angel Metatron. But sometimes it got really annoying when an angel or this scholar would possess you because you kind of wanted to have your own chedushim, your own Torahs, and so then but you couldn't expel them in a mean way. You had to be really nice to them. So we have all these different how you get rid of spirits. So if anyone's possessed by a scholar, come to me. I have lots of rituals. So our demons are scholars, and they're they're not evil. So I'll just tell one story, and then I'll go to your next question. But so we also have this tradition, right, where people use, or certainly the rabbis use demons clearly as a literary device to make sense of the world. So one of my favorite stories, and so there's one story in the Talmud that I find really funny, is that there's this demon Kirkarkion, and who is he? He enters somebody who's had too much to drink. So obviously, right, this was a way to try to explain what it meant to be drunk. It's oh man, you drink 7 glasses of wine and the demon Kirkarkion visits you. And then we have this other, probably the longest Agarata, the longest of the narrative portions in the entire Talmud, so in all 63 volumes, or 63 volumes of the Mishnah, 32 volumes of the Talmud. So the longest story is told about Ashmedai, Asmodeus, the king of demons. And it's a very long story. King Solomon needs to get access to him because he needs a special worm who can eat stones so that he can build the temple without using any hewing things. And through a whole complicated series of events, Asmodeus tricks him into getting captured and then freeing him from these chains, and he kicks King Solomon out of the kingdom and rules in his place. And starts, and people start to get suspicious because he starts requesting Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, from the women of harems to come sleep with him. People are like, what's up with that? So then they ask one of the women, so Solomon had 773 women who were concubines, which is, you always know someone went to Hebrew school if you meet a 13-year-old who knows the word concubine. And they're like, okay, when Solomon calls you into his room, does he ever take off his socks? And the women are like, no, he doesn't. Because apparently, demons can transform into the vision of anybody, but they can't except their feet. They're always going to have crow feet or goat feet. So they find the goat feet, and then Solomon comes back and says, I'm the King Solomon, and no one believes him, and it's this kind of tragic ending. And it's this fascinating story because it just, at first glance, you read it, and it just seems like one of those folklores. It seems like a story Isaac Bashevis Singer could have written. But if you actually read the story of King Solomon in the Bible, right, he starts off, as we know if you know the story, as one of these kings full of wisdom. And he ends his life in a pretty terrible way. So he collects women to excess beyond what's allowed in the Bible, and riches. He taxes the Jewish people into oblivion. He starts praying to other gods and following the ways of his foreign wives. And I think in some ways for the rabbis there was something comforting to imagine, well, maybe at the end of his life it wasn't King Solomon at all, right? It was a demon impersonating him. But I tell that whole story just to say that if you actually understand, if you look at Asmodeus, when Solomon captures him, he's not like nefariously doing evil. What does he do all day? He spends his evenings studying in the yeshiva lamata, in the earthly Beit Midrash study hall, and he spends his mornings studying in the Beit Midrash lamala. He spends every morning going up to heaven and just studying with God. So our demons are, they're scholars, they're funny, they have a lot of wisdom, and they're not sort of like evil to be banished, which is more the case in Christianity.
Should we touch on Hasatan?
Oh, like Satan?
Right. I mean, just like, I think that it's a topic that Jews don't talk about.
Yeah.
And I wish it were so much easier to tell people that they have to pay their dues or show up to minyan, because otherwise Satan's going to come and get you. And we as Jews don't do this, except that Hasatan, which has been translated to Satan, is in Jewish literature. Is that, if I'm getting too far afield, let me know. But I feel like that's somewhere in this world of the demonic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about anything. So Satan, so Satan, right, is takes on like a whole world in Christianity, but comes out of Jewish sources. So there's two places in the Bible where he's kind of mentioned. The most prominent is in the book of Job, right? So this is when, as I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, Job is living this awesome life, and he has all these kids, and he's doing like good deeds, and most blessed person on earth. And God calls together his council of angels and is like, wow, look how great Job is. And then Hasatan shows up, which is just the adversary. And he's like, well, I bet you if I tested Job, he wouldn't be so great. And so then God says, okay, do whatever you want, just don't kill him. And he, sends the trials. He has all of his children killed. He gives him terrible illnesses. And so that's really, and people have for a long time tried to figure out who's Hasatan, why does he have this, but he only ever acts with the permission of God. And then really doesn't get developed in the Jewish tradition. It's the only other place where the concept is sort of mentioned in the story of Balaam, the main prophet, the guy with the talking donkey, which is usually how he's remembered in the Bible. So he's on his donkey, and when the donkey stops, it says there in that verse that the angel there was standing like lisatanoto, was basically like an adversary to the donkey, like kind of, but it's a verb there. So it's clear that there's some sort of negotiation or something. And but interestingly, and I've definitely been interested in this, he doesn't get developed, and I think part of that is because we don't see this sort of angels of light and angels of darkness. Like, we don't want to have a figure who's kind of read as like a power against Hashem. So God is kind of always stays firmly in control.
Right. I think there's a fear of Zoroastrian influence. And in a lot of Jewish history at that time, the other, and we eschewed that idea. We have one God and one power source. And then Hasatan is kind of anything that stands in your way. And in Midrash, Hasatan shows up as anything that is an adversary. And it could be like a literal hurdle that stands in your way that is Hasatan, which then gets turned into a character with a tail and horns and things like that. We have a wonderful class on Friday mornings that all the women are invited to. And we've been going very slowly this year through Breshit, through Genesis. And one of the questions that was brought up a few months ago was about Lilith, and this idea that our religion is written by men, for men. Torah, Tanakh, Talmud, all of this seems to be male-centric, and women are magical. Women are confusing. I think that we can still mostly agree that women are magical and confusing. And so how did our tradition historically see women in these positions, in supernatural positions?
Oh, yeah, no, that's a great question. And the stories about Lilith, I think, are really interesting. In general, I find it really interesting, right, who gets like rehabilitated into like kind of, right, so Lilith has been totally reclaimed, kind of in modern feminist movements. We see, especially in the 70s, a kind of resurgence. Growing up, there was a girl in my building. I mean, she would have been like 6 at the time. I assume, God willing, she's older now. But her name was Lilith. And this totally bothered my parents because Lilith is like a demon. And it just kind of felt like maybe a little too far to call your daughter Lilith, but it is a beautiful name. So I'll say, like, I mean, to start from the bird's eye view, so women have a very interesting and specific role in the history when we look at the history of magic. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that who was kind of given authority, like theological authority, was men, so that today we like to often distinguish between sort of superstition and like silly religion and real religion, because sometimes, again, in the post-Enlightenment world, we're uncomfortable with some of the superstitious beliefs. But often, a lot of what gets written off was kind of the traditions that developed around the home. And because a lot of these traditions were not written down in books of halakha that then get preserved and published and studied, because they were women's traditions, they get lost. And so historically, when women have developed their own traditions, it gets seen as sort of a suspicious adding on. So in the Talmud, there's a sort of assumption by the male rabbis that women are always engaging in witchcraft, right? So there's actually a halakha that if you see like 2 women standing on either side of a doorway, you're not allowed to walk through it because you should assume that they're casting a spell, which I'd only ever read about. And then I was once walking with a very, very Orthodox rabbi onto the subway. And he made us go through like a different door because there was like a subway car and there was like 2 women like with headphones in, like not looking at each other. And I was like, I really don't think they're casting a magic spell. So women often get accused of witchcraft and kind of being witches. And people often like to say, oh, it was just, sexism and it was part of that, but often what it was that, right, women couldn't be the officially recognized doctors. You often had women who had real knowledge of to sickness and to health, and they had all this like internalized wisdom of what looked, but none of it was formally passed down through the sort of established tradition. So it gets seen as superstition and as counter to rabbinic authority and as a threat. So often women who were accused of being witches and of acting outside of the tradition were often women who were acting in a healing capacity in the community and for some reason became a threat. I mean, one thing, this isn't exactly what you asked, but I've always found this really fascinating, is that if you look, this is another map, but you don't have to act it out, but if you look at a map of Europe in the Middle Ages, right, and you trace when each country, well, I mean, the borders looked very different then, but if you traced when each country kind of expelled its Jews, you know, so Germany, it's 1211, England, it's 1436 or something, you know, we have Ireland, we have France, we have like all that, so like at different points in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, the Jews get expelled. And it's always about 50 to 100 years after that you start to see the beginnings of these craze of witch hunts. And I've always found that if I have time, I really want to write a paper about this, because so many of the accusations people level at witches are so similar to the accusations that were leveled at Jews, right? They celebrate inverted Sabbaths, they poison the well, they eat, you know, unbaptized children, and there's this like real fear of people who are persecuted and live at the edge of society, but are assumed to have real power, and are sort of trying to like control the world. So I think women are magical and powerful and confusing, and in times in history when they didn't have power, that was seen as very threatening. And so I think we've actually lost so much wisdom that women had by the inability to incorporate their insights in a valid way into the tradition. And so I think it's hard. I'm so grateful for the opportunities, right, that like women before me fought for. But I think there have been times where women have said, okay, we're gonna not be superstitious. We're not gonna read those incantations that our great-grandmothers would have read in Europe, because to be a real Jew, you have to do Judaism like the men do. And I sometimes think about how, well, actually those home superstitions, like what we call superstitions, was this really valid, beautiful way of being Jewish too. And sometimes that gets lost. Oh, and I didn't talk about Lilith at all, but we can go to your next. You want to hear about Lilith a little bit, or? Okay, so then just very quickly. Okay, so sorry, I'll just very quickly. The broad points about Lilith, right? So Lilith shows up in the women, demon. Okay, so where do we even start? So the stories that who is Lilith? So the story goes that she was the first wife of Adam Harishon, so Adam, the first man, before Eve is created. God creates. So right, we have two creation stories in the book of Genesis. So the first is this kind of cosmic worldview where God's creating heaven and earth, and he creates everything and it's good, and the first thing, and then, that's in the second story, sorry. So, and then he creates this being, Zachar v'Nekevim, so it's male and female, and so they're created equally. And then we have the second story where kind of Eve is created out of his rib. There's many ways to reconcile these two stories, but one way that the rabbis do is they say that Adam's first wife was Lilith, and she was equal to him. And then when God kind of realized that was an unsustainable way for society to function, she refused to subjugate to him. The reason it often gets quoted, because people love talking about more intimate topics, is that, and so then she gets banished from the physical world, and God creates Eve. And what Lilith does in her fury is she goes around at night, again, like rabbis trying to understand how the world works. She goes around at night and she steals men's semen and creates demon children. So this was just the rabbis trying to understand nocturnal emissions, honestly. I'm sure when you ask the question, that's totally right what you signed up to talk about. So, but
This is what I always teach this to the fifth graders
yeah, exactly.
every
I was
year.
like, yeah, so this is, I know tomorrow I'm talking to the Hebrew school, so this is what we'll be learning. But so Lilith, so she takes men's sperm and then she creates like legions of demon children. So, and that they're kind of like populating the world. And then she's seen particularly to be a threat to pregnant mothers. So there's always this assumption that female demons, right, they're the antithesis of womanhood, and we see this in Christianity and in many other faiths where the person they hate the most is a woman who's pregnant or like a newborn baby. So most of the traditions you might have heard about of like amulets to protect like a newborn child, maybe the week before the bris milah, before the circumcision, are often protections against Lilith, because the assumption is that she gets banished, she doesn't have a husband. You know, can you imagine a more horrible state? And so because of that, she wants to retaliate against women. And so I think because of that, people have and there's all these stories in the Talmud, right, where rabbis get visited by Lilith, and actually sometimes, you know, temptation is just called a visit by Lilith. And she's described as having this raven black hair. She can fly. There's really interesting depictions of her as this like fearsome being. So then around the 70s, that's when Lilith, the feminist magazine, is founded. If people read it, they're fantastic. And people start to say like, hey, who's this like woman who refused to subjugate herself to Adam, and who's this like fierce demon with like raven black hair who wanders freely in the world? And maybe that's a vision of female power we can actually kind of uphold and feel more like empowered by. So Lilith has sort of re-entered the canon in a new way.
So thank you. And then the 70s, we get Lilith magazine. In the 80s, we get Lilith on Cheers and Frasier. In the 90s, we get Lilith Fair. The idea of and so it changes the narrative to one of female empowerment. I do like this reframing from the supernatural to the idea of how do you explain people, especially women historically, who could make a poultice, who understood medicinal herbs to help people in childbirth and other things. We were talking before of Rivka Galchen, one of your colleagues, who wrote Everyone Knows Your Mother's a Witch, which is the story of Johannes Kepler's mother, who was based on a true story of how she was accused of being a witch, mainly because she understood that certain balms in the world could heal people in different ways. And I think we're almost substituting the word science here, that if in a world before science, how do you explain the world? How do you allow for the people who are certain that angels and demons exist? Is that a place that you in your Judaism, you grew up at 4 different synagogues, I heard, and so you camp, and your Judaism is very deep. How do you reconcile our Maimonidean rational theology with our ethereal angels and demons of tradition?
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear how you think about it, because I'll say that's not like a deep struggle that I have, that, right, if somebody, and you know, people have asked me like, well, do you believe in demons or angels? And I'll say like, I don't know what it means to believe, right? And as I was saying before, like, what does it mean that we believe in God? And what does it mean that, you know, we know that we fall in love? And I think for me, I understand the impulse to live in a world that's, that just is fluidly connected to a sort of bigger narrative of who we are and kind of what it means to be alive. I'll say also, right, I grew up in a home where my mom is very close to a lot of these superstitions, and I use the word superstitions in a very loving way. So, you know, you knock on a door before you enter, because what if the demons are living inside? And part of this, I'll say, so my mom for about 15 to 20 years was the main like assistant and translator to Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish writer, who kind of, she lost her parents when she was very young, so she met him when she was 20, and he sort of just like adopted her. And so I think together they really like loved living in a sort of in a world that was magical. Max Weber, the German sociologist, talks about the demagicking of the world, right, today, and what it means that we live in a world that's just been devoid of some of these impish, fun characters. So we had a lot of those traditions growing up, and it wasn't like, oh no, you didn't knock, like now you're gonna get possessed by a demon. It was just seen as like a way to feel sort of at home with different forces or powers that could live. So I think when you meet somebody where this is very important to them, I'll be honest, I do sort of assume it's holding, like there's like some like need for it. Often for somebody who that's a very important belief, it means they either had an encounter that they couldn't understand outside of this framework, or they're feeling in themselves a need to feel close to God and having like an angel who's by your side. And we have a long tradition of having a protective angel. That's another way actually it develops, I'll just say. So in early traditions, the angels are really at war with the humans, right? So they don't like that God gives us the Torah. We have all these like crazy stories in the Talmud where God's trying to give us the Torah to Moses, and the angels are like, he smells. And humans are bad, and like humans, they do all these bad things. And so then one of my favorite midrashim is God tricks Moses, like he like changes Moses so that he looks like Abraham, so that then when the angels try to kick him out, he's like, look, it's not Moses, it's your friend Abraham who welcomed you in the desert. Like, quick, get in here. And so we really have that, and this is kind of back when we're trying to distinguish humans and angels from each other. And then it's only like in the Middle Ages that we really get the tradition of the guardian angel, and angels become protective for us and not like our adversaries in heaven. But so I'll say, yeah, for me, I feel very moved by somebody who really believes in this world, because it seems to me like a protestation of faith in a world where it's so hard to believe in anything that we don't see. But I know not everyone feels that way. I don't know. What do you think when you encounter like a congregant or somebody where this is a really important part of their faith? Sorry, I don't know if you want to talk about questions. You can ask me more questions.
No, that's fine. I tell them there's another synagogue down the road that they can go to. I have a mixed relationship with it. I am deeply a rationalist, and at the same time, when an ambulance goes by, poo, poo, poo. My grandmother would like literally spit, but I would say poo, poo, poo. At these beautiful moments, we say kenahora, or some version of this Yiddish version of an Aramaic version of a Hebrew phrase, meaning like keep away the evil eye. And it's strange to hold these multiple truths at the same time, that I believe in a rational world. I miss the magical world of Isaac Bashevis Singer and others where there are Dybbuk's and other things. I love the opening scene of the Coen brothers movie, A Serious Man. If you haven't seen it in a while, watch it on YouTube. Or rent the movie, or buy it, or however people watch movies now. But if you remember the opening scene, it's all in Yiddish, and it's this little house in a little shtetl, and it's Yiddish conversation. It doesn't feel over the top. And here's Fivish Finkel showing up, and he's a Dybbuk. He's a demon in the cloak of like the local of a beggar, a rabbi, a scholar,
Like a family friend.
a family friend. I can't tell the difference between a rabbi and a beggar sometimes. And so you have this character showing up, and I love that. And I miss that we don't have that. And at the same time, I'm holding the truth of reality and science. And I still can't help it that when we talk about my daughter's bat mitzvah, that's in 3.5 years, God forbid, poo, poo, poo. Like, I'm still going like, and I hold that, and I see the irony or the contrast in there.
I think this is where I feel so grateful for the real like global diversity of the Jewish community, because I think so many of us are in this position where we're so the children of the Enlightenment, and we're so like the children of the scientific revolution, where we're like, well, if it doesn't, like we're like philosophers, right? If it doesn't all hold up and I can't logically justify it, doesn't my faith have to make sense? And then I think for a lot of us when or like at least I think about this when I'm in more Sephardic communities that come from like a different intellectual tradition, they don't have that same impetus to say like, no, your faith has to be like tested and logic and rational. And they can like, there's certain ways that people are much more comfortable with like just kind of moving fluidly between spaces, right? Like you can go to an Orthodox shul, but not yourself keep halacha, and you're not bothered by that. And so I think, again, if we think of it more in the realm of like literature or poetry or other things that inspire us, there's so many ways to say, wow, I'm like really moved by these stories and these traditions, and then just feel like okay being like, and I don't really, do I believe in it? Do I not? Is it silly? Who knows? It's like giving me meaning in that moment to say it.
Sure. I mean, and
Yeah.
an example of this is my older son's middle name is Haskell, which means like enlightenment. And my younger son, I sing him when I'm not here, I sing him a lullaby every night, which is Hamalach Hagoelot, which is from Bereshit, from the book of Genesis, that Jacob said to, I mean, I imagine he sang it in the Karl Bach melody, but he said it to his grandkids. May the angel who rescued, redeemed, saved me also save you. There's a piece of me that as I sing it, like I well up with emotion going, I have been blessed with this life. Call it whatever you want. Call it angels, call it luck, call it, not trust fund, that's not a thing in my family, but like, call it the fact that my parents worked hard to have a certain lifestyle and therefore, call it whatever you want. But I hope that whatever that is that has saved me from all of the pitfalls in life gets passed down to my children. And we call that word malach, angel or messenger. And so I'm able to, I hope that I bless my child to have that mystery and that wonder and that safety net that I had and that many of us are hoping to pass on to our children. We're going to open up for questions in a minute. I just want to ask, just to change gears entirely. You went to Yale undergrad. You went to Harvard Graduate School. You're very smart. I get that. Like, holy moly. How did you get into writing? At what point did you realize that your term papers or whatever, your article for the tablet just for fun, could actually be a career? What does it mean to be a writer? Because you've written for, when I say that you're coming and people go, tell me more about her, I go, you've read something she's written, because between Wired and Tablet and New York Times, and I might be getting some wrong, and Washington Post and New Yorker, and it's like you've read something at some point that you've written. How do you go from being a person who grows up on the Upper West Side or wherever into a real writer?
Well, part of it is everyone on the Upper West Side is a writer.
I understand that. Yeah.
It's more like, right, like usually it's like, oh, you're from this small town in Nebraska. It's like,
Right.
But no, so I'll say I think that the truth is like I was just a really like nosy, curious child. And I was talking to someone about this earlier today. What is really great about journalism is it just gives you a socially acceptable platform to ask strangers about their lives, right? So what I think I kind of figured out in college is that if like a really cool person was coming to campus or like something strange or interesting was happening and I wanted access, I couldn't just be like, hey, can you talk to me? Because I'm like interested. But if I was writing an article about them for the school paper, and I was like, hey, can I interview you for this article? It was really a way to get access. And then before I kind of went into writing full time, I was, so when I was in grad school, so I was focusing on like late antiquity, like the late ancient world. So this is, everything in academia is so specific. So I was studying like monks in the 3rd and 4th century in Egypt. So I was working in Egypt. I was translating Coptic texts for archaeology digs in the south and in the north. And you're just like meeting all these like interesting, fun people. And I was like, okay, cool. If you pitch a story and like write an article about it, it gives you a chance to, it gives you that like reason to go and really have to think seriously about something that interests you. So that's sort of where it really started for me. And then, you know, you just are in touch with editors and you have your ideas. Journalism's thankfully still one of those fields. I mean, there are journalism schools. I teach at one. But people will really, if you have a good idea and you have access to the sources, you can just start writing. So my first stories were for The Atlantic and for Tablet and Forward and other Jewish stories were still when I was in college, because I was like trying to justify getting funding to do like summer research on, you know, So like one of my first stories in the Jewish press was that I heard, so this is maybe an example of this. Okay, so I was talking to somebody and I heard that basically all the kosher slaughterers, so people who shecht, who ritually slaughter kosher meat, are trained in Muslim slaughterhouses in New York, because if they there's so many intricate rules, and if they mess up, the meat is still halal, because a lot of the halal and kosher rules are very similar, but halal, it's a little more relaxed. So for example, if you shecht an animal, you cut its throat, and then you drop, and you've checked the knife before that it's perfectly sharp, but then after you cut it, you drop it, and then you check it again, and this time it has a nick, because you dropped it on the floor, the animal is no longer kosher, but it's still halal. So if you're training, and you're killing all these chickens, and you mess up a little bit, it's not a waste, God forbid. So I was like, that's so cool. I was like, I must have been, I don't know, I was like a sophomore. And I was like, okay, I totally want to write a story about that. So I was able to find the one guy who ran this whole thing, and he was 84. He had so many grandchildren. He lived in this house of Brooklyn that was just full of knives, and he made knives, and he was obsessed with knives. And he was like, I was like, oh my God, can you show me your knives? And he's like, they're in my basement. I was like, can we go to your basement? He's like, and he just goes,
Seen movies that start
right,
like
and
this.
he just says to me, he's like, nobody.
Don't do it.
He literally said, he's like, nobody has seen my basement. I was like, okay. But so I went with him, and you just have all of these ultra Orthodox men, right, with the big beards, and I mean they don't wear their hats inside, and they're being trained. They're working in these small slaughterhouses throughout Brooklyn by a lot of recent immigrant Pakistani Muslims. And this is actually a relationship that goes back really far in history. So the main book that people use to learn how to slaughter kosher animals is called the Simla Chadasha. It's the Book of Laws from the 1600s. And this book was published in 1619. And in there, there's a question asked: if you're slaughtering meat in a Muslim slaughterhouse and they say that you have to insert Allahu Akbar into the blessing that you have to say to slaughter an animal, is that okay? And the rabbis are like, yeah, that's fine. Allah is just another name for God. So this is a really old relationship. So anyway, so I was wandering out all these slaughterhouses and killing chickens, and I mean, I couldn't kill the goats, but I wasn't really, I was just being taught all the parts of how to do it. If you ever are asked to visit a slaughterhouse, definitely wear boots. The floors are a hard-earned lesson. And so then I was just talking to some of my professors at Yale, and somebody was like, oh, you should pitch this story because it's sort of interesting. And so that was, so then I started a relationship with Tablet. And then I was working on a paper about Mormon missionaries. I was talking to someone here I was talking to Alan, I know, who's had a lot of experience with the Mormon community. And I learned that through just this totally random happenstance that this missionary was, so when Mormon young people go on mission, it's a very regulated process, that they were suddenly going to let them start using Facebook, because they realized knocking on the doors wasn't really working. People don't open their doors to strangers anymore. But if you have a Facebook page and people can say, hey, I'm interested, it's a much more effective way to missionize. But there was a lot of pushback among the young people, because they were like, it might make us better missionaries, but it will really devalue the experience of the mission for us, because we're trying to get off of social media. So then this was actually kind of a crazy story, because the Mormon, I had all this access to the Mormon church because they thought they were helping me write my like a school paper. And then I ended up writing, so that was my first story for The Atlantic. And it turns out I'd actually scooped, nothing makes you feel cooler at 20 than I'd scooped Lori Goodstein, who was the religion reporter at the New York Times, and they were supposed to let her break the story. So then this was another hard-earned lesson, that they were like, we were speaking to you on the record, but we didn't realize you were, we would have spoken to you differently if you were gonna go write about it. And I realized it was kind of interesting to navigate, where in college, a lot of my way to get access was to be like, hi, I'm an innocent little student, and tell me anything because I have no power. But then you had to then turn around and write about it. So I realized, actually, you kind of have to come in from the get-go with full honesty, and as a professional, yeah, tell me what you need, this is it, remind people that it's on the record, because it might feel more abrasive in the moment, but it just, I never want to be in a position, and thank God I haven't had to do this yet, where someone like regrets having spoken to me. And so like I'm so rigorous about fact checking. I always run quotes by my sources, and especially with religion, you know, you constantly, there's small nuances in theology that might not register as important to you, but you know, mean so much to the people who you're covering, especially when it's a minority tradition that isn't often written about. So yeah, it was kind of just like step by step, and then I realized it was really fun.
That's wonderful. I want to open it up to others. I just want to note, we get a whole weekend with Shira. She has been so kind to us. Friday we schmoozed at Kiddush and Oneg, and today and tomorrow you get more of a chance of schmoozing. So this is a chance for questions. Questions, as a reminder, usually start with a W word, except for how. And a question is usually a sentence or two. So if you have stories to tell tomorrow morning over eggs and not bacon, you get to have that. But for now, questions are open. Yeah.
Yeah, this is more of a comment. I never really no, boo. But over the last few years, I never really thought about angels that much. I think I'm more like Rabbi Averback in that I'm a rationalist. But in the last couple of years, many people here know I had more than my share of tribulations, two of them being serious medical things. One that I had a very serious burn accident, and one I got hit by a car walking here. And I started to think about angels and the fact that it seemed to me like I had angels here on earth, the people who, in between my 2 stays at the burn center, cleaned my house and put flowers in my room and stocked my refrigerator and all of that. And I started to think that there must, God must be, some godly presence is sending angels down upon me because I'm still alive and I look fairly normal and I'm okay. And so I started to think about angels in these two ways, both angels that I can see humanly and angels that are above and looking over me. And I think you've touched on that a little bit, but I'm kind of, that has been in my mind over the last few years as I've gone through some of these things.
So if I can turn that into a question.
Yeah.
Because it is incredible, but I'm also aware that often people who have a rash of bad luck find angels. And it's rarely people who are just living the golden life and everything is perfect who talk about angels. It's the people who are facing suffering. Have you...
I would say like gam v'gam. Like sometimes when, you've had a rash of really bad luck, you can say like, it can feel like, what is out there? And some people react to that. And then you have people who I think just, they find the parking spot right in front of the bakery and they're like, oh, my guardian angel, right? And so I think, but I'm so happy, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I do think in the way that we don't know how all of this works in the world works, there's so many ways where sometimes, we think, is it a man in the field and then the tradition reads it as an angel. And, maybe we think that there's this vast separation and there's humans and angels, but as I talked about in the tradition, those boundaries are really blurred, and there's so many ways that all of us can be like embodying what it means to be an angel in somebody else's life, and connected to that source. So I'm so glad that you found that, and I think that's important. That's like part of the conversation too.
And I love the idea that the people who help you are angels, right? That the angel isn't a disembodied seraph like we have up here on the bima of this ghostly angel, but the fact that these people who are taking the time to call you, to check on you, to bring you flowers, those are the angels in our lives. I think it's a really beautiful idea. Sure. Of course. Ben,
Yeah, I have a question. It's about the golem. and the impact that the golem has had in demons. And this is now in Prague, right? The Maharal, and he's up there in the attic. Nobody can go and see it. But what's your thought about it?
Yeah, so the golem. So again, right, like we talk about angels and demons, but there's also like this whole panoply of beings that are sort of in like human adjacent, right? And so the golem is a creature who's most associated with the Maharal of Prague in the 16th century. And he's created to defend the Jews. So he creates out of mud a creature, and then using an incantation that's actually found in the Talmud, he puts the word emet, so the Hebrew word for truth, aleph mem tet, tough, thank you, onto his forehead, which is, there's a few interesting things about those three letters. So one is that all three of them like have 2 feet on the ground. So if you know the Hebrew alphabet, none of them like a resh, right, has just like 1 foot, so it's very solid. And it's also, aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, tuf is the last letter, and mem is the letter that's directly in the middle. So the Hebrew alphabet is 22 letters. And it's known as God. So when God kind of does things like kills the evil inclination in the Talmud, which is another fantastic story, because it turns out when you do that then nobody has children or creates businesses or studies Torah, so he has to bring him back. But to show you that it's really him doing it, his seal is truth, and the word truth drops from heaven on a stone. But yeah, so he creates this Maharal, he puts the word truth on his forehead, and then it's really like a Frankenstein story in that kind of tragic way, where the golem goes out and he's beating up all the bad guys, but then he doesn't know when to stop, right? And so eventually, and well, there's actually a lot of different traditions that develop, and there's this whole debate in one of the stories about whether he can count for a minion, right? Like, which is really a question over like how human is he, right? We get these amazing questions from small medieval towns where they're trying to figure out who can count for a minion, because often there was like 9 Jews and the nearest Jew was like really far. So then somebody has a son and they're like, amazing, in 12 years, 13 years, we'll have a minion. And so then, and it's like, don't move away from home. So you get all these questions, which is like, if a 9-year-old boy is holding a Sefer Torah, can that like count for a minion? Like somehow the Torah will like add a little dash of holiness. So and so I think again, the golem, it's again trying to see like, how do we draw down God's manifestation in a world where we want a God who can protect us? And so we want to say like, okay, there are these incantations and these mystical resources, but all of the stories, they never end happily, right? It's never like, and now the Jews are safe forever. It never really works, right? Like we just had the holiday of Purim, a story that famously doesn't have God's intervention. Sometimes people will say that Megillas Esther is the only book in the Torah where God's name is not mentioned, which is not true. Song of Songs also does not have God's name mentioned. So then the golem story ends where what he does is he erases the letter Aleph from his forehead. So then we just have Mem Tuf, which means mate, died. And the being like loses life. So it's a really interesting story of this desire to kind of bring the kind of unseen world, like make it manifest in the universe, but somehow the world we live in can't sustain that magical imposition and ultimately flares out. Yeah.
Jeff.
Speaking of the Mormon Church, I used to work in Salt Lake City for a while, and a colleague that I worked with handed me a copy of the Book of Latter-day Saints, and he said, well, read it and tell me what you think. Either you think there's something there or you think it's utter nonsense. He was very liberal about it. I never got past the story of Cain and Abel, so I didn't say I put more than a little bit of my toe into it. But the 2 stories that jumped out were that the one where Eve is in the Garden of Eden, and the snake, the serpent, is presented as Satan, outright as Satan, and identified clearly. It's like a chapter gets dropped into the King James Version fully in English, and it's a whole chapter. And he has this very high-level intellectual discussion with her about how you'll be brilliant, you'll know everything, and so on. And then again with Cain and Abel, so it's Cain kills Abel, right? Got that right? So So he says, look, everybody likes your brother's vegetables and grains, and nobody likes your sheep. So if you kill your brother, you'll have both the sheep and the grains. They'll have no choice but to like you. And again, it's Satan. Have you ever done any kind of, no, I don't know if it's comparative religion, but done any kind of analysis of how the Mormon church views demons and angels and Satan as opposed to how we struggle with that concept?
Yeah, so it's actually, that's not really like a Mormon thing specifically. So for years in college, actually, I ran a Jewish Christian Bible study where the like Orthodox Jews on campus and the evangelical Christians, kind of like everybody who just came from like a really intense religious background, we would meet over the Bible and talk about how these different stories, the story of Cain and Abel, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, Adam and Eve, theologically resonated in our tradition. And so those interpretations of Satan in those stories are actually very common throughout most Christian traditions. And so the Mormon church was just inheriting a kind of much older understanding of Satan.
Ilana's hand is up over here. So nice to see you, Ilana.
Hello.
It's on.
Okay, so you were talking a lot about the different kinds of ways we could look at angels and demons depending on which part of the Bible that we're in, like early and we believe this, later we believe that, it transitioned, it has to do with the political reality and how people's thoughts and feelings are changing. And I was just wondering if right now there's any kind of answer to this in the sense of you define different Christian denominations. They believe in the Trinity, they believe in predestination, they don't. Is there any kind of Jewish understanding of, yes, we believe in this kind of demon and this makes you this kind of Jew, or is it just left to this interpretation of, some people believe in this and some people believe these other things?
So basically, like, is there a consensus? So I would say no, just because honestly I feel like there's not a consensus about anything in the Jewish community, though it's a great question. I'll say that probably the belief, I think what's actually very interesting about that is that there's very few Jewish communities, even in the very ultra-Orthodox world, where we're saying like, I'm not so sure about the demons and angels bit, will sort of disqualify you, which is not true about other theological statements, right? So for example, saying the Bible was written by God has become a kind of theological litmus test in the Orthodox world. So more liberal Orthodox rabbis, let's say, who hold more liberal positions about women's participation, about LGBTQ issues, often will kind of draw a hard line on like, God definitely wrote the Bible. And I think because part of that is there's no like values cost in saying that, but that's an issue that really becomes divisive. But I would say even in the most like black hat, pious, like ultra-Orthodox world, if you're like, I think some of them might be like our rabbi here, which is like, oh, that like it holds meaning, I use it, but like, is it really real? I would say there's very few corners where it's actually said you must believe, which is, I think, really interesting. It's a great question.
I think we're going to do like another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll have coffee, and as we're eating brownies, we can keep on peppering her with questions. So Debbie's back there.
So you started out that are angels and demons Jewish or not Jewish? And I would always say, in my mind, if someone says that, I think they're not Jewish, because I think Jewish people say the word mensch as opposed to an angel. And for demons, I think that's why we have so many psychologists in Judaism. I think people that suffer from some kind of mental stress, those are your demons. But you had mentioned earlier also, it's God's will. And I hear that often, to seem the more religious the person is, it's God's will. And you seem to hear it more in the context of something when something bad happens. When something good happens, you don't usually say it's God's will. You say thank God. So how does that all fall into the it's God's will? Because sometimes it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. And right, like also when is it God's will? And you're thinking like I'm thinking of that's the joke about a woman who is. I have a lot of parking jokes. I don't know if that's a big thing in LA or in New York City. It's like finding a parking spot. So right, she's 15 minutes late to a meeting, circling the lot, and she's like, okay, God, you know, if you get me a parking spot, like I promise I'll keep kosher for a year. And a parking spot immediately opens up right in front of where she needs, and she goes like, oh, never mind, I just found one. But I think part of our discomfort sometimes in the rabbinic tradition where people are trying to say, don't pray to the angels, don't be overly superstitious, right? Like, you know, there's all these traditions that we find this is more in the Middle Ages, like if there's a certain order in which you have to cut your fingernails, or otherwise the demons will cause you to lose your memory. I don't know if, like, right, there's all these things. You have to put your shoes on in a certain order. And we really see a tradition where the rabbis push back against this because they really want to say that no, Jews, so this comes up in the Talmud, that the Jewish people are not ruled by mazel, by luck, which in that time period specifically meant astrology, right? So we're not ruled by some like sort of chaotic like external force that doesn't care about us, but like, you know, the stars and the moon, and your luck is just dependent on something there. Like, we're ruled by God directly. We're ruled by Hashem. And there's this idea that every other land has an angel appointed to look over it, except the land of Israel, which is God himself. And, right, that's not always a comforting thought. God can be a really harsh arbiter of justice, you know, certainly in the Bible and certainly today. But there is a desire to pull us away from what's seen as, this is kind of where the pagan world, using the term not technically, but just to encompass worlds that have like multiple divine powers, is seen as really morally problematic, because it's a world where you're doing rituals to kind of like appease a deity, but not in a context of a system that makes sense. So I do really think when people are thinking about God's will, it's one of the pushbacks to this tradition are the rabbis trying to say, no, you don't live in a world where you have to do like a series of just random events to appease some outside force. Like, you know, as a Jewish people, we pray to Hashem, we're ruled by God, and maybe we don't always understand it, you know, certainly there's so many things that happen that we don't understand. But the faith tradition is trying to say that it is God's will. So I think those things are always in tension and in conversation. Thank you.
Anybody else? Joel.
So why do we need angels and demons when we have God? God is every place, all-powerful, in everything. Why do we need intermediaries? We can go direct to the source. He's in us. He's everywhere. He, she is everywhere. Why do we need these other characters?
I think that's right. That's like the heart of the question. And so I think from like a literary perspective, where these figures really develop is that there's something about like the dignity of the divine presence that you want some intermediaries, right? So that God, when he has a message to send, he can like send it through his angel, and he's not just, right? Like, God is frightening. We learn this from the story of Mount Sinai. When the Jews hear, like, you know, the first two commandments are given by God himself, and they're too frightened by it, and they say to Moses, we can't handle it, right? Like, you go talk. And so I think there's a sense that actually God in this like full, like unmitigated power would be really hard for people. So you sort of have angels who are like manifestations of him. One of the analogies that's used is a fire, and then kind of like the flames that come up out of it that sort of mitigate, kind of create, like, you think about the Sfirot in the Kabbalah, there's sort of, we need like a little bit of a ladder, of a chain that can link us to God, because otherwise there's just a chasm that it's hard for people to climb. So I think there's a way to get the fullness of his splendor. And then I think demons also develop because there's elements of our world that feel, those are the manifestations of God that are harder to understand. So I think in both elements, it's like the sort of, the bridges, I'm trying to think of a good word, the wisps of God coming down to the world. But I think if you climb them, it just brings you to the cosmic splendor.
Beautiful. Patty, was your hand up before? Patty? I don't want to put you on the spot. I saw your hand up, and I wanted to make sure
very
that.
Kind of you. I guess, unfortunately, it may be more of a comment, but I'm wondering if I make connections when there are not. And I will tell you, because when you talked about the Dybbuk with the name on his forehead, I'm reading a book. It's by a black author, and he's getting to be well known. There's nothing really Jewish in the story, but there comes a point where this one man who was a slave is really brighter than he pretends, and a white man finds him and says he wants to take him. And the white man doesn't want to own him, he wants to hire him because he knows this man has a beautiful voice. So the bottom line is this white man takes the slave and, in a sense, saves him from a horrible situation. And his name is Emmett. And I just thought, I mean, maybe that was meant to be. I mean, maybe the author.
Was it spelled with 2 T's, though, at the end?
Pardon?
Is it spelled with 2 T's?
E-M-M-E-T-T.
It's E-M-M-E-T-T.
Okay,
But,
so that's an
but it
Irish.
sounds like Emmett. And